And we're live once again. We are back. I'm joined. This is the Fantasy Football Forum. I, of course, am back as your host, and I'm joined by my co host. We are getting the band back together. Grant, it's been a few weeks, but it's been good. Hopefully, you've had pretty good summer and good time here, but it's August again now. So that means fantasy football draft season is back. How are you feeling about this,
I'm
Grant?
ready. I'm ready. We got about a month left before the season starts, so a lot of drafts are gonna be happening the next few weeks. So I'm pumped
Yep.
to get going and start looking at some players. I'm
I say
excited.
we're about 3 weeks, I think, of the biggest draft weekend. I think that happens about the third preseason, typically in August, unless you're like some where you can't wait to draft and you want to draft early. But I think the recommended thing is let's wait and see what news comes out, see if any injuries happen during preseason. But yeah, it's exciting. So a little bit different topic today, Grant. We've been kind of covered all of the NFL in the offseason at a very high level. So at that, 10,000 foot view of like what happened in the offseason. So we're now training camps are underway and the dust is settled a little bit where it's now full undergo. We are in the last month before actual NFL games. So the drought of lack of NFL is almost over. Um,
Mm,
But
mm.
for today, with the back in August, and we're back to a new season of fantasy football, I think it's good time to reset. And if there's those that listen that are kind of newer to the sport, wanted to kind of reset. I've been playing fantasy football for a while, so sometimes we talk about things that are just common vernacular to what we do here in the fantasy football space. But want to reset and say let's go through what type of things are out there for fantasy football that you may not know. You may learn something new, may have a different look on. Hey, I didn't realize that was actually a thing. But yeah, wanted to just reset. And so as we do that, Grant, how long have you been actively playing fantasy football? And before we get into too many of the types of leagues there are, what type of leagues do you like to particularly play in?
I've been playing about. It's been about 8 or 9 years, and did it. I didn't know much about fantasy ball when I started. Um, Definitely more of a college football person. Was a big
Mm,
fan. Watched some NFL games that were big, but overall wasn't really into the NFL space. Some coworker invited me to a redraft and had a lot of fun with that. Started paying attention to NFL more, really enjoying it. Like I said, you get the camaraderie with all your league mates
yep.
and just overall the banter and things like that. So I'm usually in 3 to 4 leagues a year. Right now, I'm in 2 redraft leagues and 1 dynasty league, and so I've been
Oh, very
playing about
nice.
7 or 8 years. Won a championship, or one. I've won two with my one of my redraft leagues, my 12-man league, but unfortunately have come up empty in the dynasty league and then our redraft league, as you are well aware.
Yes, that happens. And technically, we didn't have a winner in our league last year, so we're not going to revisit that though. So all on the
Oh man.
technicality. Uh, but anyway, so yes, I've been, I think if I look back, oh gosh, I think it's actually been about 15 years since I started playing. And unlike a lot of people, I did not cut my teeth in fantasy baseball. I
Mm,
did jump right into fantasy football and started with redraft, had some college buddies. We got together, and that league no longer is there. But I think we've been doing our home league. We're coming up on, oh gosh, has it almost been like 7 or 8 years now as we've done
yeah,
this?
I think so. Hmm.
Mm. Which that's fantastic to, that's part of the camaraderie of what we like about fantasy football is just getting together. It's a bunch of trash talk. It's for fun, but at the same time, we all take it seriously because at the end of the day,
Hmm.
there's bragging rights involved and who's actually the best, even though there's an element of luck if we're absolutely honest with this too. So,
Hmm.
but the goal every year is to get better and just have fun. So as long as we're doing that, I think we're winning. And yeah. So Grant, you mentioned it. I would say, would you say that your favorite type is redraft right now that you have,
Mm.
or do you prefer other types of leagues that you play in?
Yeah, so I think the two that I've played in, Dynasty and Redraft, it kind of depends. I feel like with Dynasty, if you're winning and you've got a good team, it's a lot of fun, right? It's the
Right.
same as like any kind of professional sports roster. Like, hey, my team's great. Like, we're pushing for a championship. Like, we're go, go, go. If you're a team where you had bad luck with the draw, you had injuries, people that retired, and you're behind, it's a lot more work to get good, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people don't put in the effort. So, depends on the league, in my opinion. But I think redraft is nice because it's a clean slate. So you can have 1 year where like me a couple years ago, where I seem to draft all the injured players that ever existed in the history of football, and you're kind of like, okay, this is a bad year, and you can just like basically delete the whole thing and start again, and hopefully be on the same footing as everybody else. So I think
Yeah.
in general, redraft's fun. The dynasty league that we're in, it's been a good challenge. I got the championship game of that league, and didn't work out for me. But my team was definitely more like a win now. I've got a lot of you know semi older players that are good on my team. So probably in 5 years I'm going to be in trouble. But right now, like I have a good roster, and so it's fun.
Yeah. So for those that are wondering, when we're talking about dynasty leagues, those are leagues that you are drafting after the NFL draft. So typically those are drafted in either May or June. Sometimes there are late ones that happen in July, but those are typically, if it's a startup draft, you have all the players in the NFL that you would for a redraft. Plus, then you have the rookies. If that's a startup for a dynasty league, and you're going through and drafting not only based on what particular players, positions, and types of leagues that you're going in, but you're then also you're keeping these players for their career. So if you have an older player that has been in the league for 5 years, 7 years, it's a running back
Mm.
that's on his fifth year, then his value starts to go down as far as a what he has left towards the end of his career versus rookies coming in fresh out of college that are then going to start taking some of the positions away from veterans who are then getting older and not as relevant as far as to teams that are playing. So for dynasty leagues, you're holding players typically, unless you trade them, for
Mm-hmm.
their career. So it's nice to be able to jump ahead on, certain players. Where if you see a player that you might get lucky, I think in the year Justin Jefferson came out, he was a round 2 or round 3 dynasty rookie pick. So very good value, not even going in the first round in a dynasty rookie pick. So you can have
Mm-hmm.
really good teams where they're very stacked, but also like you mentioned, Grant, you can also have years where, especially if you're looking at a 3 to 5 year window of, hey, I have good players. That is typically a 3 to 5 year window of I could probably win a championship with this team. To my guys really got hurt. They aged out. I didn't have the right people coming in, the right players I drafted to replace them. So now I'm kind of rebuilding versus can I win now? And it's not to say veterans
Mm-hmm.
don't have value because they definitely do. It's just how are you evaluating? And people tend to evaluate veterans and rookies a little bit differently when it comes to dynasty versus even redraft. So, yeah, interesting on
Mm-hmm.
that. Where also we're in August, and so if you're looking up ADP data, that is coming partly from dynasty players where who are they drafting in a
Mm-hmm.
startup or who's going where. That's part of that data that we're seeing is being driven from there. So you have to kind
Mm-hmm.
of wonder and navigate a little bit of, okay, who's seeing what and what is actually being played. The other type that
Mm-hmm.
actually ADP gets driven from this time of year as we enter into August is best ball leagues. Grant, have you ever played in a best ball league before?
I've done one. It was interesting, and I think the no, yeah, and for those not familiar, and correct me, Jeff,
Mhm.
if I'm wrong on something, but basically there's no in season management. There's no waiver wires. There's nothing else, and so there's kind of two sub options. One is you set a lineup week one and you roll with it, or two is there's a basic optimization process where Sleeper, ESPN, whatever app you have, will basically look at your projections for the week and put in the highest projection at each position. So you're not going to end up with a Travis Kelsey who's on bye, sits there for 3 weeks kind of thing. And so that's kind of like you draft at the start, you hopefully are having solid numbers, consistent people, and then you go the whole season and hope and pray that the lineup you picked is what is going to work out and beat your other league mates. You can't pick up waiver wires. There's rookies or you know first, second string people go down, and you can't pick anybody up on the waiver. That's just
Yep.
that the waiver is completely clean.
Yeah, that's I would say the best ball drafts that I've played in, it's exactly what you said where you draft your lineup, so you have all the fun of drafting, but then it's done
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
literally it is your best players that scored highest automatically inserted into your lineup. That here's what it is. And if you have the highest scoring
Mm-hmm.
team at the end, then you've won. So obviously there's an element of strategy with that where if you have half your team has the same bye week, then you're probably going to take some
Mm-hmm.
zeros that week because you don't have maybe the necessary slots to fill. So you have to kind of play okay, I don't want to stack too many bye weeks, but then that's also where a strategy of, you'll hear some people talk about um, you'll hear stacking, so like stack positions of if I want a quarterback, then I want his wide receiver, or I want a running back with something. But typically, stacking is quarterback and wide receiver. That's where you'll see a lot of that happen. Is I want to take a quarterback, so if I have Patrick Mahomes, I obviously want to try to get Travis Kelsey. That may or may not happen depending on how the draft goes, but that also then is part of that optimization of your lineup to say how many points can I score total, to where if I have guys going players going for big solid weeks scoring, I have a lot of chances of that hitting really high versus how can I mitigate the risk of not scoring as much. So yeah,
Mm.
absolutely. I've done a few best ball tournaments. I know there are a lot of best ball tournaments actually still going on right now, and if you're interested in those, I think there's a platform called Underdog. They have a bunch of them. DraftKings and I think FanDuel both have their own versions of them as well, and go on Sleeper, whatever site you fancy. I'm sure you can find it. I think they're out there a lot of places, but yeah, those are really fun just because you don't have the in-season management, but you still have the drafting. So yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So there are a couple other ones that I've dabbled in and I like to do. One, and this is part of where my title and my name comes in here, is Vampire Leagues. And Grant, you've done a couple Vampire Leagues before, haven't you?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I have.
Yeah.
And I have done a couple. They are interesting. It's a league where you do have a matchup, and based upon the results of that matchup, the winner is able to take a player from the loser's team. And so it can quickly turn into a snowball for the good players and also the bad players, but it makes for some interesting matchups because the first few matchups are very critical because then you can take players that are very good from evenly matched positions. But then later on, there typically ends up being 2 to 3 to 4 powerhouse teams that will meet each other and then take players. And so usually the winner of a league will have some insanely stacked lineup, but it's a lot of fun because it's very high stakes. And so instead of having a lineup where it's like I'm having consistent teammates, or there's strategy even of like, hey, this guy's outmatched, I know I'm gonna lose, I'll completely like you know, not start anybody. I'll put everybody on my bench, right? And that
Right.
way, or like there's different methods you can do to, there's some gamesmanship that can happen and people can get upset about it. And so I've done a couple, and I've had one where people did that and we didn't have rules set up and it got a little dicey, but they are pretty fun because it's definitely the stakes of like, hey, you can lose a player, and I mean, it gets pretty intense.
Oh yeah. And the thing I like about Vampire League, so as Grant was alluding to, you have it's kind of I would say it's combined of a redraft plus a best ball, where you'll have if it's a 10, let's say it's a 10-person league, 10-team league, you'll have 9 teams that are going to draft, and those 9 teams that
Mm-hmm.
drafted don't have availability to waiver wire, so to be able to by week pick up players. They are stuck
Mm-hmm.
with the teams that they have. But the team that didn't draft, they have access to all the waiver wire individuals, all those players that are on the waiver wire. So if you drafted Christian McCaffrey and he was your first round pick and then he gets injured, well, if you didn't draft his backup or if a team didn't draft his backup, that automatically is going to go to the vampire team. Where if that vampire team beats a team that drafted,
Mm-hmm.
then yes, that's where strategy of the vampire team can take a player from that team that they beat and be able to then give them a player of lower value. It is not a straight swap. So there's some thinking on, strategy of how do I draft and mitigate for potential injuries. Again, also thinking best ball where I don't want too many bye weeks because if I face the vampire team and I lose, I then could lose a very good player and have to try to replace that with not access to waiver wire where we'd like to do that. So yes, those are quite fun. I think I've also heard them called zombie leagues or something like that. But those
Mm-hmm.
that particular one I don't think is quite as popular, but it's also kind of a nuance. I feel like there are nuanced games that have a very niche following, but they have a very good following. Fantasy football as a whole is a really good community as a whole. But the last one, and I've done some of these, but not too much. It's called guillotine leagues.
Mm.
And those leagues, if you're familiar with it, you either have, and I guess now would be a 18-team league draft, or you could do a 9-team league draft. But the key is you're drafting in a league. Let's say it's an 18-team league, and the only goal is to not finish in last place. So you want to not score the least amount of points because the team that scores the least amount of points gets cut. So that means all the players on that roster go to the waiver wire where everybody's going out and trying to lay claim to that roster plus whoever's on the waiver wire. And that continues until you have the last game of the season where then you have 2 teams standing. And at that point in time, those 2 teams are loaded with studs from top to bottom because every team except those 2 has been put on the waiver wire. So, yeah.
Yeah. I've not done one of these leagues before, but it'd be fun. I'd like to do one. It'd be fun.
I'll say if you can't get 17 other people together to do it, that's where the 9-person one comes in. And you could actually run 2 consecutive seasons in one NFL season where if you
Uh,
did 9, by the time you got to the halfway point of the NFL season, then you can run it back again. So that's the only thing is it's a different strategy where in a dynasty league or a redraft, you might be willing to draft players who might be injured or suspended
mm,
for a few games. In a guillotine league, you can't afford that because if you're taking a 0, then it could really impact you later on, especially a high profile player. So a guy like Breece Hall, who could may or may not start week 1, has a little bit less value initially in a guillotine league where you can't take a high draft pick that could get you 0 because then you run the risk
mm,
of not being able to make it further in the season. It's hard. It's difficult, but it's also fun. That's part of the nuances of the game. Of it's not just one way to do it. There's multiple ways to play it and have fun. Um,
Yep,
so yeah,
exactly.
and
Cool.
I know there are other leagues that we're not talking about, but that's okay. Well, that's for other times. But as far as size of the leagues, Grant, what's your
Mm.
ideal size that you like to play in fantasy football?
I think it depends on the bench size, of course, but I think that the common sizes are 8, 10, and 12,
Yeah,
and typically I like 10. I think it's a good mix of having talent, but also too you need to do some research and hunt the waiver wire and kind of fill in some spots that are missing on your team. 8-person league typically, especially if you have like a standard like 7-person bench, there's a lot of like flex or streamers that you would normally play in a 10 or 12-person league. They're just on the waiver wire, they're just left there. And so
right.
people typically stick to their studs. There's not as much waiver concern unless there's a big injured player. I feel like 10's in a good spot because while you do have a decent team overall, normally injury, suspension, something happens by a week, you have to do a little bit of research and work to kind of fill in some of your spots, your weaknesses, or trade. 12-person, and I'm in a 12-person league, a redraft one as well, and we have a five bench and 12-person league. So it's
Right.
very aggressive. And so it's like typically you've got, I would say, probably 3 to 4 players that you're like feeling really good about, and then you have a lot of players that you're like, all right, potential's there, but I'm playing this person as a risk. Like this person could get me like 30, it could be 0, right? Like it's
Right.
just there's a lot more risk involved, a lot more research, and especially if you're in a competitive league, it becomes harder to like really get like a super solid team that you feel very confident with week over week.
Yeah, when you're getting more than 12, because I've been in, there's 14, 16 team leagues, it does. So every time you go up, so if you're in an 8 team league, like you just said, there's most positions you're going to have at least a stud or a very
Mm-hmm.
suitable starter in almost every one of your positions. So your quarterbacks, your running backs, your wide receivers, tight ends, all of that, where every team has a very good one. You're not running the risk of,
Mm-hmm.
running thin at those positions because there's fewer teams competing for the players. There's the same amount of players, but fewer teams
Mm-hmm.
competing for those. When you get to 10, all of a sudden, if you're starting 2 running backs, well, that's 2 extra teams. So there's 4 running backs in each round that potentially could be in your draft anyway, that could be gone. That if you're on the beginning of the draft, you have to wait till the end of the second round in a snake draft to just be able to go get players. So I
Mm-hmm.
think the
Yep.
more you increase on teams, the less likelihood of every single position being a very high value where you're typically, especially in the 10, 12, 14 specifically, 16 automatically, you are then saying you're then making a choice of, and this goes back to then how you want to draft of which position do I want to maybe not draft as high and try
Mm-hmm.
to get some more value that way on that position that I can maybe get somebody out the waiver wire or um, maybe I'm drafting somebody that's going late, but he ends up breaking out, and that's where the luck comes into it. But you're not going to have
Mm-hmm.
every
Yep.
position then that says I have studs here. So,
Yeah, and it
but
makes it more like you have to work a little harder. I mean, that's just the
yeah,
fact of it. Like, I think for people out there who aren't really sure what to do, maybe you follow a few teams in the NFL, you know roughly names of major players. An 8-person league is a great way to start. I think one is you're not in a league. It's harder to get people together for a league if they're not in one already. So
right,
8 persons is great as a starter. You can feel comfortable. You get the feel for the game. the waiver wire isn't as intimidating because there's more options. So if you have
Yep.
something that happens last minute, suspension or something, you can pick up somebody to fill a spot. I'd recommend doing that for your first league just to kind of get the hang of it. And then, as you feel more comfortable, you can eventually grow that to, a 10 or 12 person league with some other friends. But I think eight's a great way to start. It's not as intimidating. It's an easy transition into fantasy football.
Yeah, I agree. I think the first league I did was an 8-person team, and yeah,
Mm-hmm.
just grown from there. Yeah, it's not quite near as intimidating. And the fun thing with most fantasy football leagues, at least I think, is you'll typically have at least one person that takes it very seriously and will do everything in their power to win. Which,
Mm-hmm.
okay, that's yes, we're here to win, but most leagues, it is all about a camaraderie, like we mentioned at the beginning of. There's an element if there's somebody that's a little bit newer, then
Mm-hmm.
there's a little bit of a learning curve that most players typically will have, and
Mm-hmm.
that's honestly the best way to keep growing leagues, and that's it makes for long lasting friendships,
Mm-hmm.
or frenemy list if you have a rivalry in your league.
Yeah, and for everybody listening who, like I said, you're trying to figure out what to do with the league, listen to some commentary on players and things like that. With leagues, ideally it's people that you know or maybe you don't know. You become friends with them. There's some back and forth. There's some, trash talking, all the good stuff. You can do things like have your fantasy football draft at a location, someone's house. You get some
Yep.
food, maybe some drinks. Everybody's hanging out together, giving people a hard time for drafting certain players early, like the homer people who love certain teams, right? And they draft like certain NFL teams players way earlier than they should be because they're fans of the team. That, or like having punishments, or even like a buy-in where it kind of creates a little bit of incentive. Like you could have a $25 buy-in, everybody puts in that into a pot. You can have like weekly rewards that are payouts, or you can do like a first, second, third place sort of thing. So there's lots of ways you could do that to kind of help. It's not just, hey, we're all going to get on this app, no one talks to each other. Like, ideally you want some back and forth, you want communication, you want some trades, you want people to have fun with it, and that's the reason why we're playing is fun. I've been in some leagues where there's not a lot of communication, and it's still fun, but it's just not doesn't have the same level of excitement for me as the teams that I kind of banter with back and forth and have fun with that.
Yeah, I mean it's hard, like you said, to get leagues going year after year. But when you do, because there's typically like in our home league that we've had together for years, we've had teams turn over where you have to bring in
Mm-hmm.
new managers and new players coming in, and but if you have a core group that seems to be together, if you're able to get it together and doing fun things, like if you don't have a draft order set, don't just hit the randomizer on whatever app you use and go make a Olympics game or something, or go have a challenge where you
Mm-hmm.
get to then try to pick for a draft spot. But then, like you said, that builds that camaraderie of this isn't just, hey, I'm on this app and here we go. And next thing you know, it's like, well, what are we doing?
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yep,
that's the fun of
exactly.
it. So that's part of the fun. Um, so Grant, you obviously been playing a while. Do you ever? I'm gonna say this, knowing how long I've played and knowing kind of where it is. There are still a few people out there that would consider this kind of the OG of fantasy. Do you ever play in any standard leagues anymore?
Oh yes, I did play some standard leagues. That was the first league I played. It was an 8-person standard league.
Okay,
And a
so
standard league is
yep,
where, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go for it. You got right
Oh
there.
yeah,
What's a
okay. So
standard league?
so yeah, so standard league is where, so first off, the difference between standard, you might hear the term PPR, which is points per reception. And reception is when the quarterback throws the ball to a player, and then that reception counts as either a full point in 1 point PPR or half a point in half-point PPR leagues. So, for example, a running back has 10 catches in a half-point PPR league, that's worth 5 points, right? So that, and then so basically it the reason why those leagues were created was to try to even out, put different emphasis on certain positions. So for a standard league, whenever a player catches the ball, they don't actually receive any points. It's based on the yards or the touchdowns that they get when they have the ball. And so standard is typically back in the day when I played, it was focused on the bruiser running backs, the guys who would get, they would get the ball thrown to them once or twice. They're getting 25, 30 carries. It was very much running back focused. And then you had obviously the receivers that could, obviously do well and that were good. You'd pick those, but the running backs definitely went off the board first. I don't really see that anymore. I think, most leagues are in either a half point PPR or a full point PPR league, just because it also gives a little more balance to running backs that can catch the ball that aren't necessarily putting up tons of yards, like a James White, for example, with the Patriots when Tom Brady was there. I mean, he was a person on the depth chart who was, usually running back 2 or 3, would come in on third downs even, but he got 7 or 8 receptions a game and would get like 30, 40, 50 yards. Well, you're playing full point PPR, that's 12 points, right? Like that's 5, 7 points for his catches and plus 50 yards. So that's a good number for a running back and for a flex or something like that. So, as you go to half point PPR, I think is like pretty much, I think, like a balance where they try to say, okay, we're trying to value running backs and receivers the same. And then I think full point PPR is definitely more of a receiver heavy, receiver friendly league where those leagues typically have, in your flex, you're putting in every other receiver. You might even have like a 3 receiver league. Most leagues have like 2 running backs, 2 receivers. You might have a 3 receiver league in those because like it's more emphasis on the receivers and there's more receivers on NFL teams than running backs. So it just kind of depends on your style. But I think if you're like a beginner and you're trying to figure out a league, I think a half point PPR league is a good starting point because it sort of weighs both positions equally and kind of helps you have a baseline for what you're doing with your draft and everything.
Yeah, and that's a good point you bring up too. Of like if you're just new to fantasy football, or if you've only been playing a few years and you're trying to figure out some of the ins and outs, as you're looking at research and as you're trying to find stuff to read, or if you find there's a lot of rankings or cheat sheets, especially this time of year, understand if it's a standard league, if it's half point PPR, full point, because that actually changes the value of players. Where if you're in a standard league, you may draft somebody like Nick Chubb over somebody like Austin Ekeler because his value as a pure runner in a running back position is more so than Austin Ekeler, where Austin Ekeler, I'm not saying doesn't have value, it's just in a standard league, you're not getting the points that Ekeler gets for typically catching the ball out of the backfield, or somebody like Christian McCaffrey, where they're doing the same, where they are that dual threat of I can run, I can catch, and they can do it all, but it's just not as valuable because the points don't match up for each reception. So
yeah,
that's
exactly. And like with if you remember back in the day, a prime example is like Le'Veon Bell, right?
Yeah.
Full point PPR leagues. I mean, he was probably the first running back off the board every time because the little the 3-yard dump off was 1.3 points because you got a point every time he touched the ball. Well, he get 10, 15 receptions a game from Big Ben. Standard leagues, he's getting 0.3 points for that play, right? And so then he moves down the depth chart quite a bit.
Yep. No, that's and that just goes. And I think PPR, like you said, is more popular now. I know there are some purists out there, and you can comment on there if you're one of those purists and you only play standard. That's fantastic for you. But I think fantasy football, because we play it, it's a game that's played on a game. So we play it based on the game of the NFL, and the NFL has morphed more into away from a single running back pound and ground style play to there's more passing involved. It's more of the up tempo offenses. We've seen that. So there's been that shift in the NFL from running to more passing
Mm,
friendly, and there's less of that. I'm going to have one
mm,
dedicated running back to two or three, maybe
mm-hmm.
with a lot more passing emphasis. So that's where I think we've switched then now on a more popular is the points per reception or
Mm-hmm.
half point per reception than standard leagues.
Yep, I'd agree with you. And I think even people who played fantasy in the 90s, early 2000s, or even late 80s, I mean, if if that style of league existed now, I think standard leagues would be more popular because you
Sure.
have running backs that would just dominate. And like you
Yep.
said, I think that between two things. One is fantasy got more popular. People like having a more balance because it was standard leagues are very heavy on running backs. So I think half point PPR or full point, there's more balance in receivers. And in addition, like you said, now with coaching, with the introduction of the air raid, with Leach in college football, 15 years ago plus, those styles have carried over, and they're just more passing yards. Like, I mean, now routinely quarterbacks throw the ball for more, except if you're if you're the Chicago Bears, then you're stuck. But most other teams are getting high yardage quarterbacks each season, and so that kind of works well with PPR. And I think if you had a standard league now, it would really skew a lot of either podcasts or news articles or other information you're
Yep.
seeing about players because it kind of works against what people are saying.
Yeah, I mean, most podcasts, and this is also, we'll get into this next, are geared towards the half point or the PPR,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's good to keep a open, just understanding that I may, if I play in a standard league, my league doesn't quite match up to what this person is talking about, but there are still concepts within that of like, oh, this is how I may look at valuing a player or a metric I could look at that, may
Mm-hmm.
help. So knowing that, oh, the ranking from one to whatever may not fully match up. Another one that happens where if you want to dive in right off the deep end, if you're new, there's either single quarterback league, which is more of a standard type, or even on the PPR, full PPR. But if you want to mix it up and get crazy, you've been dabbling in fantasy football, and now you're also then wanting to do something different. We also switched our home league this last couple of years to what's called Superflex. So your typical flex position has running back, wide receiver, tight end that you can play. Or you can also have a super flex position, meaning you could add another quarterback to a flex position. So you're essentially playing two quarterbacks. So that in and of itself then means, there's only 32 starting quarterbacks. And even if you're in a 12 team league, depending on how many quarterbacks that you can roster, if you're in a super flex league or a two quarterback league where you're starting two quarterbacks, that then values that position a lot more than it would if you only are starting one. Um, so
Mm-hmm.
there's that nuance too, where if you're listening or reading articles, you have to really understand. Okay, they're saying Christian McCaffrey, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, they're all first round picks. That's the 101. In the Superflex League, that's not necessarily going to be the case. They
Mm-hmm.
still may be first round picks, but because the quarterback position is now elevated, you want to get the top tier guys, the Mahomes, Josh Allen's, the Jalen Hurts, all those, that then you want to have that position now because it's more valuable.
Yeah, I agree with you, and like it's different because I think going into it, like I'll be honest, Superflex, I hadn't really researched how to draft a Superflex before we had our draft party and our draft last year, and I screwed it up big time. And I say screwed it up, but I didn't properly. I didn't have a good strategy going into it, and now this year it's different, which will work, which will help me. But yeah, I mean, it becomes interesting because like you mentioned, a lot of standard leagues, running backs are going off the board first. Full point PPRs, you're going to see high value receivers. Super flex, it's going to be Josh Allen, Pat Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, like maybe like a Justin Fields type, like a running quarterback who's able to
Yeah,
like
Lamar
throw the ball and
Jackson.
run.
Yeah,
Yes, exactly. Like you're going to see those quarterbacks that are probably some of them are going to be second round picks, but mostly third, fourth, fifth round picks for the majority of the cluster of quarterbacks. And you're going to see a lot more quarterbacks go first, second round because they're going to be worth more. You're going to have a 30-point flex on your team. In addition, a lot of commissioners will change with the approval of their league some of the rules on what's worth a certain amount of points. So how
sure.
fantasy is played is it's a lot of math, right? So a lot of it's like, hey, it's a 30-yard pass. Well, each yard's worth X number of points, right? It's like a very small fractional point. And so with the approval of your league, you can change the value of that to where you make either yards worth more, worth less, make touchdowns, which are typically worth 4 points, worth six, or worth
Passing
two.
touchdowns, right?
And yeah, passing touchdowns, correct. And then I'm in a league where for fumbles, if your player loses the ball, it's -1 regardless if the team recovers it or not. So most leagues play where it's like -2, I think, if the player fumbles the ball
Right,
and they turn the ball over. But if it
right.
gets recovered by an offensive lineman, there's no point. So we play it where it's like -1 if he loses, if it's recorded as a fumble, it's -1, right? So there's kind of some little small like things that we do to like you know every league does and adjust the rules, and some of them are kind of silly and we do it for fun, but others, like in our league, we've adjusted a passing touchdown value from 4 points to six. Well,
Right.
with that, in addition to Superflex, that's a big deal because now your quarterbacks routinely can score 30 points. Like if your quarterback scores below 30 points and you drafted like a top tier quarterback, like you're in trouble, right? Like
Right.
it's you're getting 60 points from your two quarterbacks every week, or you should be. And so that definitely changes again how the game flows, the waiver wire,
Yep.
late season, what quarterbacks are on fire, which ones aren't. Like there's a lot more another wrinkle to the process when you have a super flex.
Yeah, and you make a great point of when you're going into a league, understand the scoring settings. What are those scoring settings that you have? Because when you have yards equal more points, so if it's I think a standard is 25 yards equals 1 point for passing for quarterbacks, and
Mm-hmm.
if it's down to 20, then that means it's more points able to be scored to for the quarterback position. And when it's 6 points per passing touchdowns, what that's doing is kind of equaling out between, like we have the dual threat quarterbacks, where Lamar Jackson's the Josh Allen's one of them, Justin Field, but it's the quarterbacks that will rush almost, they'll take a rush and almost as much as they'll throw. So they'll get points from their rushing yards plus their passing yards. And if they
Mm-hmm.
rush a touchdown, it's worth 6 points. So if a standard league, a passing touchdown is worth less because it's only 4 points. So all the pocket passers, the players, the quarterbacks that don't rush the ball, your Joe Burrow's not really known as a rusher. Trevor Lawrence isn't really a rusher. Rushing quarterback. I mean, I know they can. We're actually, I think, in an era of the NFL where I think we have more rushing quarterbacks or quarterbacks that can rush than not. But guys like Jared Goff or Kirk Cousins, those types where they're not known for the rushing, but if it's a higher points that then they still have that value where they may get drafted later on in drafts because they have a lower value. They still aren't going
Mm.
to, they're not going to hurt your chances of winning a week by week just because they don't do some of those other things. Like you said, that's just
Mm.
another
Yep,
wrinkle in
good point.
strategy. So,
Yep.
but so what is, if I ask, do you have, and let's stick with, I mean, I'm going to stick with standard, not super flex drafting styles, and all of these can be wrinkled into a super flex, but we'll just keep it basic and simple. So if you're listening and you've been playing fantasy football a while. You're probably bored, but we appreciate you listening. We'd like to keep continuing. There's still going to be some value here, but just understand we're not going to go super off the deep end quite yet. We are just in the beginning of the 2023 fantasy football draft season, so we will have more and better content coming out in the weeks to come. But anyway, sticking with a typical single quarterback league, call it half PPR. We'll just leave it at half PPR. What is one of your favorite, or do you have a favorite drafting style?
So I think for me, I have typically, I guess for half point PPR, I've typically done more of like an hero RB approach in the past, which is
Okay.
normally you have one stud running back who is proven. So, for names, Christian McCaffrey, a Saquon Barkley, Le'Veon Bell back in the day, LaDainian Tomlinson 17 years ago when you started playing,
Way
right,
back in the
Jeff?
day.
Like something like that, where it's like, yeah, exactly. Like you have a proven running back who you're drafting in the first or second round. Then you focus on receivers, tight ends, and quarterbacks. And I've done that typically. This year, I think I might swap it up just because of how running backs are valued both by their teams in real football sense and also with fantasy. There's less of an emphasis on having this stud who's going to have 30 carries a game. That we're trending away from that, and that's evident by Jonathan Taylor can't get a contract together. Josh Jacobs is having problems with getting a contract. And like these
Yep.
teams don't want to sign running backs to these big contracts because the data shows now that while some of these elite running backs do have a great, yard per carry, rookies or replacements who are at the NFL level, who are professionals, who are the best of the best, right behind
Yep.
these guys, their yard per carries are just slightly lower. And you're not paying the 18, $20 million that Zeke got with the Cowboys. And so I think teams are the days of a running back getting more than, 10, 11, $12 million are over. And so that's affecting fantasy where instead of having like a robust running back draft style, which is typically drafting 3 or 4 running backs in the first 5 rounds, really loading up on running backs, I think a lot of people are going to either a hero RB where you have a guaranteed like a Christian McCaffrey or a Saquon, or you're doing like a zero RB, which is focusing entirely on receivers, tight ends, or quarterbacks, and then kind of getting either a rookie or maybe a second string or other running backs later rounds. And so we're seeing a lot of these like real football consequences happen in fantasy.
Right. And just kind of go off a little bit on tangent because that's, I think, the biggest news of it. And I don't disagree with you at all because we're getting from the actions of NFL teams, of NFL owners, it is a state where they don't want to pay the running back that position a lot of money because to them, the style of football, it's devalued in a way that it doesn't produce wins. So owners and front offices are looking at it saying, well, the running back doesn't help me get, 3 or 4 more wins a game. So therefore, why would I want to pay them more when the true value lies in the quarterback? The true value lies in the right tackles or the left tackles. The true value lies in the corners. Like those are the true values. That is true. And I'm not going to say it's not true because we don't watch an NFL game that is one running back just going 30 times right through the middle of the line, getting 2 yards. Like that's not the style we see. However, where I do understand from the running back's perspective, right now they are not valued in a monetary way much more than kickers. And I would argue that the running back has actually more value than a kicker. I understand a kicker at the end of the game can win it or lose it for a team, but that kicker has one job. It's to kick a ball through the goal. And when the kicker makes a couple $1 million less or right around the same as a running back who has more chance of getting injured, who is putting more out there for his team, who has a skill set that not very many people have still. And yes, I understand that can be said for a kicker. That's where I do understand the conundrum of these running backs saying, we are actually worth something. At the end of the day, it comes down to, will an NFL team pay them? What? And so it goes back to, it's all about money, but I understand from both sides a little bit of, I don't want to do this because on paper, on the data, it doesn't show me an extra win if I have that elite player versus a little bit less of a player as far as like a tier down. Or do I just, pay them and have that elite player? So it's interesting, and I think we can get on how do we navigate this trying time with running backs maybe on next show as well. But yeah, I think you talked about having a hero RB strategy. You have that anchor running back where this is the running back that is going to anchor my team. I'm going to draft him early, and then I don't have to think about it for a few rounds where I can load up on other positions. That's kind of a balancing approach, in my opinion, where you're not avoiding taking a high profile player because you value that high position. You want the top tier guys. You don't want to say, I'm going to risk it and try to have double up tiers at another position and then see, I'll just, mind the waiver wire. So you mentioned zero RB strategies where I'm going hot and heavy for wide receivers, for tight ends, for quarterbacks, for, all the other position. And maybe by round 8, I'm drafting a running back. That's my first one. I'm going to go draft. And those can work. First of all, I'll throw a caveat out there. In my opinion, there's no one draft strategy that says this is the right and only one that you should do. I'm not a believer in that. So I'll throw that out there, as a caveat. I think it depends on your draft room. Last year, I'll give an example. Last year in our home league, I had a plan of how I wanted to draft, but knowing how everybody was drafting, seeing that kind of shifted my plan on, I think I can find value in these, so I'm not going to go with what I originally said. So if you're going into a draft and you say, I'm drafting 0 RB, okay, that's great. What happens if everybody else in your draft is drafting 0 RB? Then if you're drafting at the 7 spot and all wide receivers, Travis Kelce are off the board, and you're at the 7 spot, and you can pick. Well, I'm going to pick. I get CMC, or maybe I get, whoever the 7th, wide receiver. Let's say it's Chris Olave. Well, he's not first round pick. Anyway, it's a matter of value then, in my opinion, of like, how do I want to draft? The one thing I'll say with the 0 RB, which I like that strategy too, and I think you're right with how you're reading. We're very reactionary, and last year we saw a lot of wide receivers boost value, and the running backs did not. So I feel like there's a lot more people coming into drafts saying, I need to get wide receivers first. If you're going to do a 0 RB, the main thing I would say to do, you have to mine the waiver wire religiously, because that's when you're hoping for an injury to a starter that then somebody else is coming for that job. So that's where you have to be early on that. So it takes a little more in-season work, but it can be done, because if you find that gem of a running back in the double-digit rounds or off the waiver wire, and you already have, let's say, 2 wide receiver ones or Travis Kelce plus, CeeDee Lamb or something like that, and you have that top tier running back, that again gives you your edge. So that's where that edge comes in. So it takes work, but I think it's definitely doable.
So what do you think about? So we kind of hit the big running back draft styles, right? So what other draft styles have you seen in leagues that are popular or you've seen league mates do?
One that is popular that I think is becoming less popular, but it's still there, is a robust. So you go opposite zero running back, you do a robust running back, where that is basically doing the flip, where I'm drafting a running back maybe in the first 3 or 4 rounds, and then I'm going to go after my wide receiver, and I'll go get my uh maybe in the fourth round I'm picking up DK Metcalf as my wide receiver one,
Mm,
where then I have Saquon, then Chubb, then whoever else in the third round. So I'm really solidifying that strategy. Really stems off of the running back being a very fragile position, meaning that's historically the most injury prone position.
mm,
And
yep.
that's also the danger of, if you don't have many, um
Mm,
so you do a zero running back, zero RB strategy, um you're then susceptible. If one of yours goes down, you may be hurting and starting a third string or a second string as your starter, because that's just how it happened. And I don't like drafting scared of injuries. We can get into a whole, like, there's a whole argument sake of what's an injury prone running back or player or not. But um, so that's kind of that opposite approach of, I'm going to draft multiple running backs. We touched on Superflex as far as like a little bit where that just elevates quarterback positions. Um, The only other ones that I really see is when a team decides, and this is kind of a little bit more, you've been playing fantasy football for a while, you kind of, you're looking out for some things, and there have been analysts out there that, you know, push the notion, and I think we're kind of on a shift with the type of quarterback play that we have. There's a lot of very good quarterbacks. And
mm,
the elite ones are stepping ahead of the ones that are more average. But you can, in one quarterback league, so if you're not in the super flex, do what's called quarterback streaming, where you're basically then saying, at the quarterback position, I'm going to wait till very late, and
mm,
I may be the last person in my league to draft
yep.
a quarterback.
Yep. Yep. Done
You
that
ever
before, and
you done that
yeah, I've
before?
done that before, and it was my second year, I think, of doing of fantasy, and it didn't work out well, honestly. So again, it was like the first year I was like 8-person league. I'm just kind of doing whatever. I drafted some decent players, but the second I started to get too cute with stuff, and I think I did something like Kirk Cousins, and at the time he was in a good spot, didn't have a good year, and it was tough. So it was bad, and then I didn't know how to draft and how to recover from that, and I was having to do the whole waiver wire streaming and looking who was playing the Jets, for example, to pick someone who I was going to do that week, and it wasn't good. I with the more experience, I could probably try to pull it off. It happened again, but man, it was hard in the moment. Definitely tough.
Yeah, it's one of those, you definitely want to make sure you know what you're looking at when you do that. And a lot of it, like you just mentioned, is what defenses are quarterbacks playing against. But if you're going in a league that you're not the only one potentially doing that strategy, you can still get, kind of thin at the quarterback position. The kind of the thought behind it, though, is that over the course of a season,
Hmm.
you can get to where your continual quarterback play, and obviously this is I'm going to play quarterback from team A on week 1, team B on week 2, and like, you're just rotating through and through. There's not a set quarterback for you. It's not I have Patrick Mahomes, I'm going to set it and doesn't matter now. But your goal is then, can I get maybe 70 to 80% of Patrick Mahomes' production
Hmm.
out of streaming, and then
Yes.
from that make it up with everybody else because I drafted higher tier players more consistently than taking a quarterback.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, and that's a trade-off. Is like I think with streaming, you're saying, okay, on average, quarterbacks are worth, you know, I don't know, 28 points a week or something, right? And then you're saying, well, a top tier quarterback is worth 35, so I'm giving up 7 or 8 points. Can I make that up with other players that I've drafted to kind of bring up?
right.
And like you said, it's this balancing game, and it that I think for a beginner is really tough to do. I think for some of the more important positions, maybe a beginner like myself at the time, you pick a steady quarterback if you can early on, maybe even a tight end, and then you mix and match the running backs and receivers. I think maybe I don't know. It's
Yeah.
every person's different, but as a beginner, it definitely is more work. You're trying to understand how to play the game. It's definitely more work to balance also a quarterback and a tight end because you got really cute with the strategy. And someone who has experienced pain, depression, anxiety from fantasy football, you understand like, all right, I made these decisions, I screwed this up, I need to fix this, and you're able to kind of like, finagle some stuff on the waiver wire and turn into something decent. But for a beginner, it could be overwhelming. And what you don't want to do is get in too deep your first season, and then it's like really frustrating, and then your team is not great because of decisions you made, and then it kind of leaves a sour taste in your mouth. You want to be able to like at least have fun with it, right? That's the purpose of,
Yeah.
of the game, within the game.
Oh, yes. Well, and like you said, the key is one, if you make a mistake 1 year, learn from it, move on, get better.
Mm-hmm.
Just because one
Mm-hmm.
strategy doesn't work 1 year, or you may have had the right strategy and you may have just picked the wrong players. Okay. That's one of those. We've all had those frustrating years of like, man, if I only would have done this. We all have 2020
Mm-hmm.
hindsight, or hindsight's always 2020. So we always have perfect vision
Mm-hmm.
with that. So, Grant, as we are now in the drafting month, it is the one of the best months of the year because it's fantasy football draft month. What would be one of your tips for people as they are preparing for their fantasy football draft?
I think the biggest thing is do a couple of mock drafts. I think is the biggest. That's my biggest tip. Is understand what your league rules are. If you don't have, if you have an app like ESPN, Yahoo, Sleeper, the three most common. But what I like to do is even when I had ESPN or Yahoo, was go on Sleeper. You can sign up for an account if it's free. You can plug in information about your league, half point PPR, how many people are in it, et cetera, and put yourself in a draft slot. Computer will draft your other positions based upon the average draft position or the ADP we've been talking about. So they'll kind of go through, and there is some slight variation with how the computer picks the players, but for the most part, it's pretty consistent. So you can kind of get a feel for like, okay, these players are being picked. Here's what I should be expecting is like, like okay, I know Patrick Mahomes, he's going to come up off in the second round normally. So that way, you don't think you're going to get him in like the fourth round, and all of a sudden you're left there with nothing in your hands, right? When you expected him to come to you. So that's what I recommend doing is do that. It probably takes like 10 to 15 minutes with computers because the computers make a decision in like 1 or 2 seconds. So you can go through, make your pick in 2 minutes. The computers go like they do all the draft picks. Um, in most leagues, it's a snake draft format, which means that the person has the first pick will go first. You go to the end, say there's 10 people, 10th
Yep.
player makes their pick, and then the next pick, the 10th player goes again, and it goes backwards. That's to ensure balance. Of course, you would never want like like a typical real football draft position where your team was not good and was awful that year, and so that way you got a higher pick, and then you restart the round that way. In fantasy,
Right.
to try to make things equal, it's a snake draft format, and so you can it's pretty fast, and so you probably in 15-20 minutes can do one mock draft, see who you got, see how you liked it. Do 2 or 3 of those, kind of get a feel for it, and then you'll be better prepared than your league mates, or at least have an idea of what's coming, and then you can kind of adjust when a player gets picked early, or someone that you really liked got picked. You can kind of adjust accordingly.
No, that's good. Good advice, because the more like mock drafts help get you prepared some, and I think it's more preparing for what is more realistic. And I think the only other thing I would say too is on draft day, if you've prepared, your league settings, obviously know when your draft is. So don't be late to your draft, because worst thing you can do is auto pick. If you're auto picking, that's not a good thing. Never want an auto pick. But be ready then. If you have that information, man, I like this player. I like where he's going in ADP. I like where I could potentially draft him. Be ready to pivot off that if you have league mates that they don't go off ADP. They just draft whoever they want to. So you might be able to find some value in players of, hey, this particular player dropped. I wasn't expecting that, but can I change my strategy to say I'm going to allow for this, and then what do I need to do to change? So don't be stuck on one particular player or one particular draft style that says, well, I must draft this way. So, we talked about robust or hero RB, zero RB. Those are all great. But be ready come draft day to find that value then too. And don't just say, well, I have to draft this way because this is the way to do it. There's more than one way to do it. It takes a little bit, but that's where, you're talking about, Grant, of mock drafts. So if I want to do one mock draft, I'm going to take a hero RB. Let's see how that works out. What does that look like? What could that look like? What does a zero RB team potentially look like? What if I take 2 running backs in the first, second round, or first 3 rounds? What does that potentially look like? And look around your draft spot. If you're in the middle of the rounds, if you're in the middle of the draft, look at the players going 2 or 3, both before and after, because that could fluctuate come draft day. So you may have a few players that you can choose from them. So that would be my key tip, is just be ready to change, but just know how you want to change. Don't be stuck on one particular thing. So, yes,
Agreed.
It is here. We are now in August. We're almost over the off season now, Grant. So we are now switching from off season news to, all right, it's draft season. How are we doing this? And I think the most important news or thing to remember for people is have fun. This is a game. Don't get too serious about it, and have fun with it. So
yes, yeah, exactly. And all this is done is honestly, podcasts like this and others, this is for people who like having fun, but also too, you want to be competitive and you want to be good at what you're doing. A lot of people are, like I said, you want to have fun with your friends, but also too, like you want to understand how to play the game. You understand how to be optimal, look for trends and stuff that we'll talk about in the next few weeks. But the purpose is to have fun. And yes, you can get competitive. It is great to pick up on a running back or another player that's flying under the radar, and you pick them up and they end up being this crazy high scoring team at the end of the season that everyone's like, wow, like this person did a great job. But at the end of the day, it's to have fun, right? And so that's the important thing. If you're not having fun, make sure you adjust, what you're doing, your expectations, like your time. You don't want this to consume your life. It's meant to be a fun little thing with friends or family, and like again, it's mostly that in conjunction with screaming on your couch every Sunday at your team.
Yep, or at your players if you have them on your roster and they're not doing what they should.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly.
Well, until next week, we will have more draft strategies and discussions coming your way. But until then, like and subscribe us on YouTube, and we're also on Spotify. So find us out there. And if you would like to share with your friends, do that as well. We appreciate that. And leave a comment if you have something you'd like us to touch on or reply back to. Let us know. And always happy to do that. But until next week, we will see you all, and happy drafting if you're drafting early.